Welcome to Shire Hall. My name is Anne Brown and I'm the Learning Manager here at Shire Hall Historic Courthouse Museum. We're sat in the courtroom today of the Old Crown Court of Dorset, which is where justice and injustice at times was dispensed between 1797 and 1955. We're sitting in our original beautiful Georgian courtroom where countless thousands of ordinary Dorset folk found themselves in front of judge and jury for a variety of crimes and offences. Most famously, in 1834, this was the scene of the trial of the 6 agricultural labourers, later named the Tolpuddle Martyrs, the founding fathers of the modern trades union movement. With me today is Andrew Munro, who is a volunteer here at Shire Hall and a member of the Hardy Society and has a great interest in the life and times of Thomas Hardy. So welcome, Andrew, and thank you for joining us today. Firstly, could I ask you, could you tell us what was Thomas Hardy's connection to Shire Hall?
Well, literally, where do we begin? He grows up in Dorchester, goes to school within a few hundred yards. Of course, he was born in Bockhampton, 3 miles away. We can't prove he ever came to the court as a young man when he was at school, but it was around and about all the way through. And then when he returns as a successful author, he eventually does become a magistrate here in the court and serves that very different role. We know there are 2 incidents in his youth that we are aware of. They are both hangings, public hangings. He was one of the crowd of thousands on the water meadows below the jail, watching Martha Brown be hung. A case now that would probably be argued that she might well have been acquitted on grounds of domestic abuse. But at the time, she was one of the last women to be hanged. He was about 16 at that stage. A couple of years later, one of the last men to be hung in the country, James Seal, again was hung outside of Dorchester Prison. Hardy has a telescope and goes up behind the cottage onto a hill and watches that hanging alone. He actually finds that more disturbing. Now, we can speculate on why. Was it actually just being on his own rather than in quite a merry crowd, which the hanging crowd seemed to have been? Or was it the fact that Seal, the hanging was botched? His neck was not broken and he was slowly strangled. But it certainly caused much more of an effect on Hardy than Martha Brown had done.
So Hardy's early life was spent here in Dorset. Does he actually stay here or does he move elsewhere?
Oh no, he was quite ambitious and he went off to work in London for a period, which complete contrast to his time as a young man in what was still a very rural county. During his time in London, he maintained his interest with the courts. We know that he certainly goes and observes the courts, and when he starts to drift out of architecture, one of the first pieces he prepares is a piece of writing describing the law courts, but not an architectural piece, but something that was much more looking at the people within the courts, something which Hardy was, of course, very good at observing. His hope at that stage would become a columnist for a local paper or more than one local papers. He would write a weekly column and then would sell that for them to publish, Hardy's View from London or some similar phrase. He also has visits at various points in his life, collecting notes on observing in the courts, what he calls novel padding. We know that certainly happened on at least one occasion, but I suspect he was, when he had nothing else to do, spending time gathering notes. although he's in London for quite a while, he's never really comfortable. I suppose at heart he really is a country boy. And so he starts looking to return to Dorset and the heart of the developing area of Wessex, as he is now beginning to call it. He stays in Sturminster Newton for a while, Yeovil, Wimborne, before finally really deciding that Dorchester, or is it Casterbridge, is where his heart and his writings really need to be centred.
So what happens when he comes back to Dorset? Is this when his involvement with Shire Hall first begins?
Oh yes, he secures a lease on the land which he's going to build his house Maxgate on, and then moves back to Dorchester, renting a property whilst the work is going on. He arrives back in Dorchester in the summer of 1883, and his property that he has is in Glide Path Road, or sometimes referred to Jail Lane. It's just at the back of Shire Hall. Literally, he can come out of his front door, and he would have seen the small door going into the back of Shire Hall, the door through which the prisoners come and go during their trials. Thomas Hardy is appointed a magistrate even before Maxgate is finished. One of the requirements to be a magistrate is you have to live within 7 miles of the court at which you are active. So that's perhaps why he couldn't do it any sooner. But as soon as he arrives, he is involved in the process. To be a magistrate, you have to be male, living relatively close, and there are various different property qualifications. So we are talking about self-selecting middle-class men. Courts at that time were quite different from what we know now. But at the most basic level, there were the petty sessions, the borough petty sessions. They were really dealing with matters within the town. Thomas Hardy is appointed to all the courts at the same time, but the petty sessions are where he is most active. He does about 20 sessions in the court in Dorchester, but that is over about 8 years. Now, considering that the court was being held weekly, his appearance must be called a bit patchy, but not everybody was clearly going to be there every week. It was a group of people who were called, but also he has patches of illness, and he is travelling at least back up into London and sometimes further afield, so he is not available to appear in the courtroom here. So Thomas Hardy is appointed as a magistrate. At that time, the system was quite different from what we know today. There were the borough magistrates, the petty sessions, which would deal with matters within the borough. Beside those were the county petty sessions, which were similar in level, but were dealing with more rural matters in the main. Then the quarter sessions, which is going more serious, and finally the assizes. At the magistrates level, perhaps in many ways, things haven't changed. When a case comes up, it can either be dealt with there, and certainly the magistrates were dealing with things like beatings and fining and imprisonment, perhaps for a week or so. Then they could also refer, as magistrates do now, to a higher level if they thought the case was beyond their scope. But also, county councils were very new. They were appearing at about the same time as Hardy appears here. And so they were dealing with matters that we would now expect to be dealt with by the council. For example, the appointment of overseers to operate the poor law within the parishes. Now, the magistrates were, we have to say, male, property owning to some extent, but unqualified. So we are talking about very much the middle and upper classes of the county. They were unqualified, but it does seem as if they took it quite seriously, some of them, including Mr. Hardy. In one of the interviews that he gave at Maxgate a few years later, he actually has a copy of Stone's The Justice's Manual behind him. It does sound as if that is the beginner's guide to local justice. The next level were the quarter sessions, as suggested by their name, taking place 4 times a year. They were dealing with more serious matters. There were, however, more trained and qualified staff within a quarter sessions courtroom. The magistrates at the petty sessions rarely sat alone. We are only aware of Thomas Hardy sitting himself on one occasion alone. They would normally have half a dozen or perhaps more people, would then make a decision, which was always represented as being unanimous. At the highest level, we had the assizes, which broadly is equivalent to the Crown Court today. This would be trying the most serious of offences, and ultimately it was possible from there that a person would be hung. The assizes were run by a professional judge who would come down from London for a week and would listen to all the cases that were waiting for him. The court was relatively close to what we are familiar with today. There were a jury of 12 men, and it was only men, who would listen and decide on the guilt of the accused. But what was different was before that, there was a second level, the grand jury, something which has long since disappeared in the United Kingdom. Possibly the closest thing now is the Crown Prosecution Service. And we are aware it still exists in America, and President Trump had grand jury hearings last year. The system there is that there are a second group of men who would hear the offence that has been tried and would decide if there is a case to be answered. Only if the grand jury decides there is a case will it then be sent for a normal hearing.
Do we know about any of the cases that Hardy heard at Shire Hall?
We have a few. Sadly, many of the records either didn't survive or are under closure. But getting from the newspapers, we can see some of the things. Many of them are drunk and disorderly, and the petty theft and matters such as that. But the magistrates would also be looking at things that now would probably be handled by the county council. For example, at some county petty sessions, 3 cases that came up was one, an eviction from a property, another one about a water supply not being of good quality. I think everywhere was very concerned about the quality of the water. And remember that Dorchester had cholera occurring in the middle 1850s. But perhaps the most interesting of how things have changed was a case against a man who had stopped paying for his wife to be maintained at the lunatic asylum. They were living in Fordington, I have to say the worst place of Dorchester at that time. What Hardy would describe in the Mayor of Casterbridge as Mixham Lane. The case is really quite sad. The man wants to take his wife home. and the view of the professionals at the asylum is that either murder or suicide would result. They decide that she cannot be released and the man must continue to pay for her upkeep.
So does Hardy use these experiences at Shire Hall in his writing?
I'm sure he does. I suspect that writers today, fiction on the television or whatever, things that come up in court cases must be a good source of which they can then adapt. Also, we know that Hardy used to go and read the newspapers just down the road in the newspaper office to get other stories. Now, one we are definitely aware of is included in The Mayor of Casterbridge, perhaps one of his greatest tales. The story is that Michael Henchard sells his wife to another man whilst drunk, having been eating furmity, sort of porridge that actually had lots of brandy added to it. Years later, Henchard is a successful man and he is mayor of Casterbridge. As was often the case around the country, mayors became magistrates for a year, ex officio, whilst they were mayor. The furmity-selling woman is brought up into the court, charged with being a disorderly female and vagabond. She recognises the now respectable Michael Henchard in front of her and announces to the court who he was and what he did, which of course destroys all his credibility. And basically, the world Michael Henchard has constructed then starts to collapse around him. The first edition of The Mayor of Casterbridge says the offence was disorderly female and vagabond. But in the edition that came out about 1895, it had become disorderly female and nuisance. So it would appear that Mr. Hardy is either taking his work from Stone's Manual of Justice or literally from his time in the court to make a little tweak to make the offence more what was actually written in law rather than from his imagination.
So does Hardy serve in all the different types of court sessions at Shire Hall?
Yes, at some stage, but he gradually moves up from petty sessions to grand jury, and roughly the last 15-20 years of his service here as a magistrate, he is only actually working on the grand jury. In the latter stages of the First World War, he actually returns to the petty sessions. It's basically what we would now call black market work that he is trying to deal with. War profiteering, as they called it at that time. Most of it concerns things, meat in particular, being sold without the right paperwork. Of course, rationing existed at that stage as well. He said it was the only war work that he could do, considering his age. But it's also said that Florence used to find it difficult after the war to get tradesmen from the town who were willing to deal with her in the normal supplies to Maxgate. Perhaps the most interesting case, the most fun case that I've certainly come across so far, is after Mr. Hardy has retired from the Crown Court. He's invited back by the judge as a visitor. It actually concerns a mutiny. It's a civilian ship coming from Canada just after the end of the First World War. Most of the issues initially seem to be around things like food, but there is eventually a mutiny. The red flag is flying, which apparently is the recognised flag for mutineers. But another ship is summoned by the newly invented wireless, and the mutineers are put off at Portland, which is why the case comes to the Crown Court here in Dorchester. It was really quite a serious matter. The leader of the men is actually given 5 years in prison. So it's clearly seen as a very serious thing. But it is said that it does sound like something out of something like the Dynasts, Mr. Hardy's stories of the Napoleonic Wars from 200 years ago, rather than something that was occurring in Dorchester just on a century ago. So by that stage, Thomas Hardy has retired as a magistrate, although he lives for another 10 years until 1928. After his death, the petty sessions stand in silence at the next session, but the assizes, which took place not long after he died, the judge pays tribute to the man and his literature. There is no mention, not even a footnote, that Thomas Hardy had served as a magistrate in the court here. But I wonder 10 years on if that little aside to his main literary work had already been forgotten.
Thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. It's great to hear how Hardy played such an important part in Shire Hall's history, and also great to see that his experiences here were reflected in his writings. So thank you so much.